Let's talk Nosferatu, which is the latest film from Robert Eggers and is a adaptation of the 1922 silent German Expressionist vampire film from F.W. Murnau, which starred Max Schreck as Count Orlok. Now, I will tell you, this is not a beat-by-beat adaptation of that said movie. This very much so takes it into a different direction, but it does have the core element of it. You do have a real estate agent, and you do have a count who becomes obsessed with real estate agent's wife, and things escalate from there. So this film is a long time coming from Eggers. He's been wanting to make this for so many years now, and he's finally been able to release it now on Christmas Day. This is a Christmas movie, I will tell you that. This is set in the 1800s, and it follows real estate salesman Thomas Hutter, played by Nicholas Hoult, who is tasked with finding a new residence for a wealthy Transylvanian count named Count Orlok, played by Bill Skarsgård. While trying to fulfill his task, Hutter learns that Orlok is a vampire and is also infatuated with his wife, Ellen Hutter, played by Lily Rose Depp, and things are about to just go insane. So, in this film, you follow Lily Rose Depp's character of Ellen Hutter, who is the central focus of the film, something that Eggers wanted this to be like, and he also talks about this sort of fascination with Wuthering Heights by saying, "It was always clear to me that Nosferatu is a demon lover story, and one of the great demon lover stories of all time is Wuthering Heights, which I returned to a lot while writing the script. As a character, Heathcliff is an absolute bastard towards Kathy in the novel, and you're always questioning whether he really loves her or if he just wants to possess and destroy her," which was something interesting you find out in the movie, is that the Count is very much infatuated with Ellen, up until the point that he just wants to be with her and has him do some careless things, I would believe, as well. But in this film, Lily Rose Depp is a young woman who has this sort of clairvoyance to her. She's able to tap into the spiritual realm. She's able to really transcend herself somewhere else. And at the beginning of the film, we see her calling out for a spirit, for a guardian angel, for somebody to just hear her. She talks about being a lonely child, being a feeling of ostracization, that she doesn't have anybody around her that she can really connect with. And so this is where she just starts tapping into whatever can hear her, since she has this connection to she doesn't know that this is not a guardian angel that has heard her. It is actually the Count Orlok, so more like a demon of sorts. And he has become infatuated with her throughout the years now, wanting her, needing her, and he finally realizes that she is within his grasp, and that's why he's trying to move closer to her and has this whole deal he's about to do with her husband, unbeknownst to the husband. So one day, many years after she has made this connection with the Count, we see that she is now married to Thomas Hutter, and he is about to embark on an expedition to try and go find Count Orlok a new home. He's sent by his boss, Murnau, to do this. Now, we quickly realize that this was all just a setup. Thomas Hutter was set up by Murnau to go to Count Orlok and pretty much give away his wife. Ellen Hutter is left with Frederick Harding and Anna Harding, who are friends of the couple. These are the characters played by Aaron Taylor Johnson and Emma Corrin. Kind of trying to deal with everything happening to Ellen because she sort of falls into a state of delusion. So they call in a doctor who is played by Ralph Ineson called Dr. Willem Sievers, who's supposed to help her with all of this. But to him, it just doesn't seem that there's anything he can do. And so he starts to realize that maybe they need to call in another expert who's more into the occult, and that is controversial scientist Professor Alvin Eberhard von Franz, who is played by Willem Dafoe so brilliantly. I tell you that. In the review I made, I said that once Willem Dafoe steps in, the movie just becomes something else. While they're trying to figure out what's going on with Ellen as she's having convulsions and she's speaking in these different languages and just having these very outrageous moments, back to Thomas Hutter's expedition, he goes through a village, and in this village he sees that they do these rituals of sorts to a vampire, to something that is dead, and they carry this woman through a horse, and she's naked, and it's kind of like they're giving her up to whatever said force this is, or they're setting up a trap. I wasn't too entirely sure what they were doing, right? And at first he thought he was just dreaming, but he quickly realizes he wasn't. This was in fact actually happening. So he sets out to leave, and then he comes and encounters a carriage that takes him to Count Orlok's castle. At the castle, the Count says that he will address him as his lord, and then we see that he has him sign some papers. And these papers, unbeknownst to Thomas Hutter, are not just to buy a house. They are in fact to give up his wife to the Count. And we see that then Thomas Hutter is being slowly totally drained of his blood by the Count during the night, and so he just has to make an escape, which he does, and goes on to find his wife as he realizes that the Count wants his wife. Now, the Count is on his way already to the town as well, as he makes his way on this expedition, which was a part of the book, of course, from Dracula, The Last Voyage of the Demeter chapter, and we've already seen a movie that was just based on this. So he's on this boat, and at the same time, he is bringing a plague with him with all of the rats. He's also feasting on all of the crew members, so there's a lot going on here right now as they're trying to find out what's going on with Ellen. The Count is on his way with the plague, and we see Thomas Hutter on his way to try and warn Ellen of what's going on. Now, right before Thomas sets out to go back to find his wife, he is taken into like a monastery of sorts where they tell him that he is free of the demon and all of this, but that he needs to stay here because he is still kind of weak. But he says he can't. He has to go find Ellen and warn her, which he eventually does arrive to the town, but at the same time, the Count arrives to the town as well. Now, while all this is happening, her knock was already in custody due to him being like insane. He has completely lost it, and he is saying that his Count is on his way and that he is going to serve him. Evil attachment to the Count to do his bidding. And we see him escape once the Count arrives to the town after killing everybody on board of the ship that he was on, as well as releasing a ton of rodents that are just infected with the plague onto the town. That same night, Thomas Hutter arrives into town to warn Ellen as well, but it's pretty much too late, as we see that Anna Harding then becomes the next victim of the Count, and we see her start to go insane, which pisses off Frederick Harding, as he feels all of this is just happening because of Ellen Hutter's insanity. He doesn't believe in Professor Franz talking about a vampire. We see that things really escalate when we see the Count then kill Anna Harding and also his children that he had, and then they just have to bury them the next day. Now, the Count has already told Ellen she has 3 nights to choose what she's going to do, and that she better make the right choice or he's just going to kill everybody because he wants her. And we see that Professor Alvin Everhart von Franz realizes that this may be the only way to stop the vampire. They realize that the vampire needs to sleep in his own tomb in order to be able to live further on before sunrise comes out. And so the plan that Thomas Hutter and Professor von Franz, as well as Dr. Sievers, has is to go into the vampire's tomb right before the sun comes out that morning and then just kill him in there so he's not able to escape, and then he pretty much dies from the sunlight. Now, the thing is that von Franz says that this might not exactly work, and him and Ellen Hutter talk about her sort of like luring the vampire in, having the window shades open in order for the sun to come out, and thus the vampire sort of gets stuck there with her and ultimately dies. They don't say this to Thomas Hutter or Dr. Sievers, however, so they lay out the plan. Thomas Hutter, Dr. Sievers, and von Franz, as well as with Frederick, are going to go out, and they're going to go to the castle and impale the vampire into his tomb and not let it close so the vampire can then die. But Ellen Hutter and von Franz have their own plan. While the 4 men go do this, act be luring the vampire to come to her residence and then keep him there until the sun comes out. So von Franz tricks Hutter into thinking that he will be the one to destroy the vampire, but doesn't tell them the plan he already made with his wife. Right before they head out, they try to figure out what's going on with Frederick, who hasn't showed up, and they quickly realize that he himself is dying from the plague now, as he goes to the graveyards of his wife as well as his children to ultimately die there with them. And we see the men find him there dead, and they burn the bodies so that the plague cannot sort of spread. They then go to the Count's castle, where they open the coffin only to find her knock in there and not Count Orlok anymore. They kill her knock, and then they burn everything, the whole thing, so the Count does not have anywhere to reside anymore. Hutter and Sievers get pissed off that they've been deceived by von Franz, and they realize that him and Ellen had made another plan, which was for Ellen to keep the vampire with her until he dies when the sun comes out. We see at Ellen's residence as the vampire approaches her and begins to suck her blood. It's for the vampire to stay with her as we see the sun come up, and the vampire still stays there, eventually dying once the sun's up. Ellen as well dying because of the amount of blood that has been taken. Thomas Hutter, as well as Professor Everhard von Franz and Dr. Sievers, arrive to find Ellen as well as Count Orlok now dead, and the film just ends right there. So very poetic ending. Okay, so let's get through some of these things first, right? The Count. Why does the Count look the way they do? Well, Robert Eggers says that he wanted to base the vampire on how it's described in really old folklore. He says that he does appreciate what Nosferatu 1922 did and other vampire films, but that they're described as rotting flesh. And I think that that look was well executed by Robert Eggers in this film. I really did dig it a lot, honestly. I do think that that is definitely the way to do it. And he also wanted the vampire to really rely on hypnosis and things like that, which is something I think we don't really see a lot with vampires nowadays, which has always been a fascinating thing for me. Now, in terms of the story in itself, we can assume that Count Orlok got to Hernok at some point and hypnotize Hernok to become his minion, or dog as he calls him at a point. And he knew that Thomas Hutter was married to Ellen at this point and wanted to sort of infiltrate them. Now, he couldn't just get up and move around, right? He is this very old vampire and he does need some help moving around. So he did have to sort of establish this fake thing that he wanted a castle in another area. Now, of course, it wasn't just like, I just want a new home and that way I can get a real estate agent to come here. He needed to be close to Ellen. So I think as the years went by, when Ellen and the Count first made this connection, he sort of started to realize where Ellen was, and that's how he was going to infiltrate everything and just take over. Now, the village, of course, where Thomas ended up first in the movie, I think was a village that had been like taken over by the Count, and they were doing his bidding for him, giving him these sacrifices as well throughout time in order for them to be safe. We've seen this in other folklore of vampires when they talk about it, as well as in Dracula, that the vampire pretty much has control over the village, and the village has to relinquish a sacrifice every so often in order for the vampire to not just kill everybody. And so I think Thomas experienced that night, and I think that that was an interesting way to really showcase what Count was trying to do in the place where Thomas and Ellen lived. And so I thought it was such a fascinating way to really explore this tale of the vampire obsession, which can be interpreted in many ways, and just a beautiful story that Eggers really did here for sure. About how they wanted Lily Rose Depp's character of Ellen to sort of be the central focus of everything happening around here. And we heard her talk about this on the red carpet, saying Ellen's perspective is one that we've never gotten to see in such a central way as this one. And Rob made the deliberate choice to make Ellen's perspective the central one. And we see this story really unfold through her eyes, which I think was such a beautiful thing, and it was an honor for me to play. And it's very exciting because I think while of course this is a story we are familiar with, this is really a fresh take that is very different from any other iteration. The character I found so incredibly empowering. I feel like there's so much strength to her. She has so much agency also in the story without giving anything away. She kind of calls the shots in a very cool way, and I found her incredibly empowering and inspiring. I love playing her. Eggers also talks about sort of choosing this different perspective to the story by saying in the 10 years of trying to make the film from that first draft to now hasn't changed a lot, but I think that has the most appeal to me now with the version of the story is that it centers around Lily Rose Depp's character. It's the female protagonist story. The Murnau film, which I love dearly, becomes Ellen's story by the final act. She becomes the heroine, but this is with her from the very beginning, which I was hopeful would create a more emotional and psychological death. Maybe it does. You tell me. He also talks about the way that he wanted this version of Ellen to feel like a woman who, despite understanding things on a very deep level, doesn't have the language to articulate her experiences. And he wanted to sort of emphasize in this story how men's misogynistic preconceptions of women are kind of a monster in and of themselves. He goes on to say that Ellen's husband loves her, but he can't understand these hysteric and melancholic feelings she's experiencing, and he's dismissive of her. The only person she really finds a connection with is this monster, and that love triangle is so compelling to me, partially because of how tragic it is. And I think that's something that I think Ellen realizes at some points, that she's never really had this psychic connection with anybody else except for the Count. Although she does say Thomas was a big part of what helped her get out of this melancholy or feelings, it still is the Count who has always been in her mind. Skarsgård also talks about the portrayal of his character and talks about Nosferatu and Count Orlok by saying, Robert has been marinating the story ever since he was a little boy. I read the script the first time 10 years ago, and the script didn't change at all that much. So he was very particular with the stuff that he wanted, but in terms of creative freedom, when you have a director that is that specific, he goes, I want you to work within this frame. It's liberating to an extent because you go, here's my parameters, and then what can I do with those parameters? But the look of the character, Robert had made a digital drawing of the character that I saw years before we started to shoot that looked like the guy. So I think with the ending of this film, Nosferatu, I think one of the clear things here is that I think Professor von Franz made it clear from the beginning that he had no clue how the vampire exactly worked. And one of the things that he just assumed was that vampire had to be back in his own sarcophagus of sorts, coffin, whatever you want to call it, before the sun had risen. And so the plan of Thomas Hutter was just to stake the vampire so it would be stuck to its coffin and would just stay there and wouldn't be able to come out. I think Professor von Franz as well as Ellen Hutter kind of saw this as it was kind of risky, it may not work, and eventually if it didn't work, then that would mean that Thomas Hutter and the rest of the team there would just die and the vampire would still be loose, causing more chaos throughout the years. I think Ellen Hutter and Professor von Franz knew that the vampire was so infatuated with Ellen that it would just be with Ellen throughout this time. There was this psychic connection they both had that the vampire found so alluring to want to venture out and come to Ellen himself. There was already kind of like the vampire was like in a way so transfixed on her that it was just going to not really think that straight, I think, in my opinion. And I think a lot of the parallels between Ellen as well wanting to have something more and her husband dismissing her and all of these feelings are things that Robert Eggers has talked about when making the film. He wanted to make that perspective of a woman during this time who didn't feel like she was being heard and she was just being dismissed all the time. We saw it with her husband at the beginning as well, and also with Frederick and Anna, who were just sort of saying, I think he just missed your husband, that was it. You aren't really going through anything, even though the doctor and also Professor von Franz knew that something else was up with her. I think also the whole thing with the lilacs being purple and all of that really signify a lot with the character as well, because it talks about the lilacs being a representation of love, spirituality, emotions of love, and just purity and things like that. And I think that was one of the things that this sort of represented for the Count with Ellen. And so I think with the ending of the film, it is told in such a poetic way as well, because it is something that von Franz finds out about through a book, that the only way to really relinquish this vampire is through the heroine. The woman has to be the one that sort of is the hero of the story here, because that is how it's told through the book that von Franz reads. Now, of course, there could have been other ways to really handle this, but you have to put it into your perspective that these people had never encountered such a thing. Even von Franz says he's only read about them and never really seen one in person. So could there have been another way? Possibly, but it was too risky, especially with the plague already in the town and things like that. And I think Ellen and von Franz just knew this was the only way to really do all of this. And I think Ellen also felt some type of way about her being the one that invoked such a creature all of these years now, so it could possibly be tied to that. But I think it really showcases just how much love Ellen and Thomas had for one another, that Ellen was prepared to risk her life in order for Thomas to be able to live, because she says that all her life she had never really felt love or felt that she was wanted by anybody until Thomas came into her life. And I think that that was the reason she felt so compelled to keep Thomas safe and to keep him alive. And I think it really switches up the roles. What we normally see in movies with the male is the one that takes sort of the, I would say, sacrifice in order to have the woman be the one to go forward, right? And it showed a lot of courage and a lot of love from Ellen to really take that leap and say, you know what, I think this is the only way. I have to lure this very evil creature to me, keep him here until he's dead, and even if that means my life is taken, at least I know that I did good for everybody else around me, especially for the one man who has always loved and cared for me. And I think it truly just makes it that much more of a tragic romance than a horror film, and it really does hit harder now that I'm thinking about it for sure. I don't know, I really like the film. I think it is such a poetic and gothic horror film and truly about romance at its core, and it does have this very arousing feeling to it, especially with the Count sort of trying to psychologically manipulate both Thomas, Ellen, and everybody else here in order to achieve what he wants. But at its core, we still see that love still kind of rings through, and purity and all of that, and it is such a beautifully told film from Robert Eggers. I'm excited to talk more about it with y'all and analyze it even more. I gotta watch it again and really get through it, but these are just my initial thoughts on a first go around at the ending. I think that Ellen sacrificed herself due to love. She wanted the Count to be gone, and she knew that this was the most safe-proof way to do it, especially with Von Franz and Ellen realizing that the demon and her had this very close psychic connection. So it would be something that was going to be hard for the Count himself to even break that as well. And we saw it at the end. We saw that the Count kept feeding on her, even though he knew that the sun was coming up, that this would be the end. That's just how strong of a connection he felt to Ellen, that he didn't really care about his own life being taken, just as long as he could have Ellen for one time. And I think that that definitely even more exudes the point of obsession and love and all of that throughout the film. So it's a very interesting film, one I'm sure we'll talk about more and more throughout the ages, and I'm excited to do that. So let me know what you think about the ending, if you have another suggestion on the ending and all of that. I do love how Eggers does incorporate more of the older lore to vampires than what we've seen recently, and really takes it much more medieval, I guess you could say. Something I do want to talk about when I talk about all three Nosferatu films, and that's going to be a video I'll probably do next week, so stay tuned for that. But tomorrow is the holidays, and hope all of you have a great holiday. We will talk about Baby Girl tomorrow in a video, so stay tuned for that. But as always, follow me, subscribe, hit that notification bell. Let's get to 36,000 subscribers before the end of the year. Big goal right there. And as always, I'll see all of you next time. Stay safe, stay positive.